I've lived on the same stretch of land outside Dry Creek, Oklahoma, my whole life. And if there's one thing country people understand better than city folks, it's this: land remembers everything. Every fence post, every cattle trail, every busted knuckle that went into building something with your own hands. It stays there long after people are gone. That's why what happened with my barn hit me the way it did. Not because it was worth a fortune, not because it was pretty. Hell, most people driving by would probably call it an old collapsing fire hazard. But because my grandfather built that barn in 1948 with lumber he hauled himself after the war, and every man in my family left a piece of himself in those walls. So when some suburban HOA tried to erase it with a fake property claim, yeah, they picked the wrong old rancher to play games with. It started when I left town for a 2-day livestock auction over in Amarillo. Nothing unusual. I'd done that trip 100 times. Before I left, the barn sat exactly where it always had, north end of my property, past the cedar fence line, standing crooked but stubborn against the Oklahoma wind. Then I came home Sunday afternoon and saw a bright orange notice nailed right into the front door, like somebody planting a damn flag. Unauthorized structure. Removal required within 30 days per Cedar Ridge HOA compliance codes. I just stood there staring at it for a second because my brain honestly couldn't process the stupidity. HOA compliance codes? On ranch land. My nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away and half his cows wandered onto my property every other week. But then I looked past my pasture toward that shiny little subdivision they'd built 2 years earlier. Rows of identical gray houses, identical mailboxes, identical SUVs parked in identical driveways, like somebody copy-pasted the entire neighborhood out of a corporate catalog, and suddenly it all made sense. Cedar Ridge HOA had been trying to push farther into surrounding ranch land ever since developers showed up. They hated looking at old barns, tractors, cattle trailers, anything that reminded their residents they were living beside actual working land instead of some fake Instagram countryside fantasy. And leading the charge was their HOA president, Vanessa Holloway, a woman who smiled the way snakes probably smile before biting somebody. I'd dealt with her once before after she complained that my windmill was visually disruptive to property values. Lady moved next to a ranch, then got upset there was ranch stuff nearby. Imagine that. But this time, they'd gone way further. Turns out while I was gone, the HOA filed paperwork with the county claiming my barn sat partially inside their development boundary. And somehow, because bureaucracy moves at the speed of a drunk turtle, somebody approved the complaint without double-checking the original surveys. So now, according to county records, my grandfather's barn was suddenly an illegal structure. I could actually feel my pulse in my ears reading that notice. Not because I was scared, because I was insulted. There's a special kind of arrogance some HOA people develop after a while, like signing violation notices suddenly makes them feudal royalty. They start believing they own not just property lines, but reality itself. And Vanessa, oh, she absolutely believed it. I found that out the next morning when I drove over to the Cedar Ridge Clubhouse to confront her directly. The place looked exactly like you'd expect. Fake stone entrance, little decorative fountain out front, golf carts parked like luxury vehicles, and a giant sign bragging about community standards. Vanessa stepped outside wearing white capri pants and sunglasses big enough to block a solar eclipse. Before I even spoke, she crossed her arms and said, "Mr. Grady, I was wondering when you'd finally come discuss compliance." Compliance. The way she said it made me want to laugh and punch a fence post at the same time. I told her my barn had been standing there since before half her subdivision even existed on paper. She smiled. Not nervous, not apologetic, confident. That was the part one remember most. She genuinely thought she had me cornered. According to county filings, she said, the structure is currently in violation. Then she tilted her head a little and added, "You really should have updated your land records years ago." That sentence right there told me everything. This wasn't a mistake. This was intentional. Somebody at that HOA thought an old rancher wouldn't fight back, figured I'd either panic or cave under legal pressure. Maybe they thought I was too old to understand paperwork, too isolated to afford lawyers, too attached to the land to risk court. And honestly, that assumption ended up costing them the most expensive mistake of their entire little suburban empire. Because what Vanessa Holloway didn't know yet was this: my family kept records the same way other families kept Bibles. And buried inside an old metal filing cabinet in my house was enough documentation to burn her whole operation to the ground. Now let me pause the story for a second because this is where a lot of people get blindsided by HOAs and county paperwork, and honestly, it happens way more than folks realize. See, according to standard procedure, when an HOA files a boundary complaint or zoning dispute, county offices usually process the paperwork first and investigate later, especially in fast-growing suburban areas where clerks are overloaded and developers are constantly submitting revisions. Most people assume, if the county approved it, it must be true. Nope. Counties make mistakes all the time, especially when somebody submits updated plats or partial surveys designed to confuse the system. And from a legal perspective, possession and history matter a whole lot less than documented surveys, deed descriptions, and recorded boundaries. That's why old ranch families like mine obsess over paperwork. My grandfather used to say, "A handshake settles cattle deals, but paper protects land." Smart man. But here's the psychological part nobody talks about. This is a psychological trap HOAs sometimes fall into after years of controlling small things. They spend so much time telling people what color fences they can paint or where trash cans belong that eventually they start believing authority equals ownership. And once people get addicted to that feeling of control, they stop checking whether they actually have legal ground beneath them. Vanessa wasn't trying to fix a property issue. She was testing power. She assumed intimidation would work because most suburban homeowners fold the second they hear words like compliance violation or legal action. The lesson here is simple. Never panic when somebody waves paperwork in your face. Calm people with records beat loud people with confidence almost every single time. And trust me, once I opened that old filing cabinet back home, Cedar Ridge HOA was about to learn that lesson the hard way. I got home from that meeting with Vanessa and went straight to the back room of my house, where my grandfather kept all the family records. Old ranch families don't throw paper away, we archive grudges. Inside this dented green filing cabinet were tax records, livestock receipts, land surveys, handwritten notes from county assessors dating back to the Truman administration, and buried under 40 years of dust was the original boundary survey from 1948. Signed, stamped, sealed, the real thing. I spread everything across my kitchen table that night like I was planning a military operation. Coffee on one side, survey maps on the other, rain hammering the windows outside, while I compared every line inch by inch against the county's updated filings. And that's when I noticed something strange. The HOA's revised parcel map didn't just accidentally include my barn. No, the entire northern edge had been shifted several feet west. Sloppy enough to look believable to a tired clerk, but deliberate enough to grab part of my land. That was the moment my anger changed shape. Before, I was offended. Now I was hunting. Next morning, I drove down to the county records office with a cardboard box full of documents riding shotgun beside me. The clerk behind the counter was a younger woman named Alicia, probably late 20s, looked exhausted before I even opened my mouth. I told her I needed every filed revision connected to Cedar Ridge development for the past 3 years. She gave me that look government employees give when they know their day just got worse. 2 hours later, we had maps spread across 3 desks while she compared the legal descriptions side by side. Then suddenly she stopped talking, just froze there staring at one line. "Sir," she said quietly, "this filing shouldn't have been approved." I leaned over the desk, and there it was. The HOA surveyor had altered the reference marker coordinates. Tiny change, easy to miss, but enough to shift the boundary line directly through my barn. Alicia's whole face changed after that. You could tell she realized this wasn't some harmless paperwork error anymore. This was fraud. By the end of the afternoon, the county voided the violation notice entirely and opened an internal investigation into Cedar Ridge's filing history. Most people probably would have stopped there, celebrated the win, maybe cracked open a beer and called it justice. But something about Vanessa's confidence still bothered me. She'd acted too comfortable, too certain. People only behave like that when they think they're protected somehow. So I kept digging. And brother, that's when the universe handed me the funniest thing that's ever happened in my entire life. Public land databases are amazing if you know how to read them. Hidden inside archived development documents was an older topographical survey from before Cedar Ridge finished construction. I laid it beside the current plat map and nearly spit coffee all over the table laughing. Their clubhouse, the crown jewel of the whole subdivision, wasn't fully on HOA property. Not even close. The western corner of the building extended almost 6 feet over my boundary line. 6 feet. That giant luxury clubhouse with the fitness center, pool, tennis courts, and all those little wine and cheese HOA meetings was technically trespassing on my ranch. I laughed so hard my dog started barking at me. See, karma has a real twisted sense of humor sometimes. They came after a 70-year-old barn while their own million-dollar clubhouse sat illegally on my land like a drunk guy sleeping in the wrong motel room. That same afternoon I called my attorney, Russell Dean, an old country lawyer who looked permanently disappointed in humanity. I explained the situation and there was this long silence on the phone before he finally said, "You are not going to believe how much leverage this gives us." By Friday, we filed a formal encroachment complaint and sent Cedar Ridge a certified demand letter requiring immediate removal of all unauthorized structures crossing onto my property. We included updated surveys, county records, historical plats, everything. Clean. Precise. Fatal. Vanessa showed up at my ranch the next morning in a black Mercedes SUV that probably cost more than my first 3 trucks combined. She marched up my porch wearing pearl earrings and enough perfume to stun livestock. But the confidence from earlier? Gone. Replaced with controlled panic. "Earl," she said, trying way too hard to sound calm. "There's no reason to escalate this." Funny how people discover the value of peace negotiations the second they lose leverage. I leaned against the porch rail and told her, "Seems to me y'all escalated things when you tried stealing my barn." Her jaw tightened. "That clubhouse serves over 400 residents," she snapped. "You can't seriously expect us to tear it down over 6 feet." I shrugged. "And you expected me to bulldoze 70 years of family history over fake paperwork." She stared at me for a second like she genuinely couldn't understand why I wasn't intimidated anymore. Then came the threats. Lawsuits. Court costs. Delays. She hinted I could lose access easements, face environmental complaints, even get buried in litigation for years. Classic pressure tactics. But here's the thing about people who rely on intimidation. Once it stops working, they've usually got nothing left underneath. So I just smiled and said, "Well, Vanessa, I guess we'll let the judge decide." The court hearing happened about 6 weeks later, and let me tell you, Cedar Ridge walked into that courtroom still believing money automatically beats truth. They brought 3 attorneys wearing $1,000 suits and enough binders to build a small fort. Vanessa sat behind them stiff as a statue, barely looking at me. Meanwhile, Russell showed up carrying 1 leather folder and a thermos of black coffee. That's when I knew we were going to be just fine. According to standard procedure, boundary disputes usually become technical wars between surveyors, and ours did exactly that. But the difference was brutal. My side had original deed records, historical county surveys, aerial photographs, tax documentation, and testimony from 2 retired county assessors confirming the original property markers had never changed. Cedar Ridge had revised plats and 1 very nervous surveyor who suddenly couldn't remember certain measurements under oath. From a legal perspective, judges absolutely hate fraudulent filings because they undermine the entire property system. And once Russell demonstrated that the HOA knowingly submitted altered coordinates while simultaneously building across my line, the mood in the courtroom shifted hard. You could actually feel it. At one point, the judge leaned over his glasses and asked the HOA attorney, "Are you seriously asking this court to enforce a boundary your own client violated first?" Man, the silence after that question was beautiful. Vanessa looked like somebody unplugged her soul. The final ruling came 3 days later. The court formally dismissed the HOA's claim against my barn, referred the altered filings for fraud review, and confirmed the clubhouse encroachment onto my property. Then came the part that really hurt them. The judge ruled Cedar Ridge had 2 options: remove every encroaching structure and restore the land at their expense, or negotiate a permanent commercial land lease directly with me. And because demolishing that clubhouse would have financially crippled the entire subdivision, they folded almost immediately. Russell handled the negotiations while I mostly sat back, enjoying the irony of it all. In the end, Cedar Ridge signed a binding lease agreement paying me $7,500 a month for continued use of the land beneath part of their clubhouse and recreational facilities. $7,500 every month from the same HOA that tried to erase my barn from existence. But my favorite part wasn't even the money. Nope. Buried deep inside the contract was a default clause Russell insisted on adding. If Cedar Ridge ever missed multiple payments or violated the agreement, I retained legal authority to terminate occupancy rights and force structural removal at their expense. In simple English, if they stop paying, I can legally make their precious clubhouse disappear. The first payment arrived in a white envelope about 30 days later. HOA logo stamped right on the corner. I remember sitting at my kitchen table staring at that check while sunlight came through the window toward the old barn outside. My grandfather would have laughed himself unconscious over the whole thing. These people looked at an old rancher and saw somebody outdated, stubborn, easy to push around. They thought history was weakness. Turns out history was exactly what buried them. And every now and then, usually early evening when the wind hits the pasture just right, I walk out toward that old red barn and look across the field at Cedar Ridge's fancy clubhouse sitting partly on my land like the world's most expensive apology. Then I grin to myself, because life has a funny way of balancing accounts. They tried to take my family's legacy away from me, and somehow ended up turning their own pride and joy into my most profitable tenant. You know, ever since this whole mess happened, people around town keep asking me the same question, was it worth it? And honestly, yeah, not because of the money either. Don't get me wrong, that monthly lease check is nice, especially when it comes from the same people who once threatened to bulldoze my barn into splinters, but that's not really the point. The real victory was proving something a lot of folks forget nowadays. Just because somebody speaks confidently, waves legal papers around, or hides behind a fancy organization doesn't mean they own the truth. And I think that's why stories like this hit such a nerve online. Most people have dealt with some version of a Vanessa Holloway before. Maybe not an HOA president specifically, but somebody who mistakes authority for superiority, somebody who assumes rules only apply to other people. This is a psychological trap powerful groups fall into all the time. The longer they go unchallenged, the more they convince themselves they're untouchable. Then eventually they push too far, and suddenly reality punches back. According to standard procedure, HOAs are supposed to protect property values and maintain shared spaces. In theory, that's fine. But from a legal perspective, HOAs only have authority inside the boundaries actually granted to them. The second ego starts stretching beyond those lines. They become vulnerable. And Cedar Ridge learned that lesson in spectacular fashion. But the lesson here is bigger than HOAs. It's about documentation, patience, staying calm while somebody else loses control. If I'd exploded emotionally, threatened people, or ignored the paperwork, they probably would have buried me in delays and technicalities. Instead, I did the least dramatic thing possible. I gathered records, verified facts, and let their own arrogance collapse under its own weight. Funny enough, that's usually how real power works in life. Quiet, prepared, precise. And maybe that's the strangest part of this whole story. I never actually set out to beat them. I just wanted to protect one old barn sitting on the same patch of Oklahoma dirt where my grandfather left it all those years ago. Everything after that, the courtroom victory, the lease payments, the clubhouse becoming my accidental business investment, that was just karma freelancing over time. So now I want to ask you something. If somebody tried pulling this on your property, would you fight back? Or would the pressure make you walk away? And be honest, because most people never know until they're standing in the middle of the storm themselves. Drop your thoughts in the comments, especially if you've ever dealt with a nightmare HOA, shady neighbors, or property disputes that spiraled completely out of control. I read more of these stories than you'd think, and trust me, some of them are even crazier than mine. And if you enjoy these real-world revenge stories where arrogance backfires in the most satisfying way possible, hit that like button and subscribe, because the next one might make this HOA disaster look polite.